started? Yes. I'm MacGuineas. I run the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thanks for joining us today. Our organization, we thought it would be interesting to have a discussion about Social Security reform, and is it time to have another commission, as we are at the 35-year anniversary of the last time we did major reform of Social Security around the Greenspan Commission. So obviously we're coming off of an election where entitlement reform and Social Security reform in particular were not central to the discussion, to the policy discussion. There was some talk about protecting the program, there was some talk about expanding the program, but there really was very little discussion in the overall campaign about the various things we would do to secure the solvency of the program. So our organization, bipartisan organization, we don't have a position on how one should fix Social Security, but we do believe, as the trustees warn us every year when they put out the numbers, that delaying the changes to the program that are necessary to ensure solvency end up having very high costs and can really do a lot of damage to the people who most depend on this program. That is the backbone, part of the livelihood for many people who are retirees, current beneficiaries, dependents, and for many workers who are planning to use the program and depend on the program, but having the unknown situation of what reforms will take place is really not helpful for adding security to retirement and other parts of the benefit structure. So we're really excited to host this discussion today. This is part of a series the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is doing on digging deeper into the policy issues that we started during the campaign. We will be doing throughout the year on a lot of different issues that affect the economy and affect the budget. So today, I'm really pleased that we are hosting Congressman Cole and Congressman Delaney, two leaders in Congress, two very influential leaders in Congress, I would add, who have come together, who have a bipartisan bill that would put forth the Social Security Commission. Are you saying you're not influential?
Well, if we were, this bill would have already been.
Well, it's all about baselines compared to other people who don't even have bills. No, we really are really pleased with the work that they've been doing, and we're hoping that we can take a look at how commissions can help, both in terms of fostering bipartisanship, creating a space where some of the thorny or technical issues on policy can be worked out, and of course creating political cover so that people can deal with some of the hard issues. Social Security, as we all know, is one of those topics that has most been in the center of controversy and doesn't lend itself to kind of the serious wonky policy discussions that we'd like to help facilitate. So we're really glad to be joined by them, and then we have the tremendous Scott Horsley from NPR, who is going to lead a panel of us in a discussion following as we hear from the two members of Congress. So Congressman Cole, Congressman Delaney, I'd like to invite you up to speak. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Alphabetical. Okay, that's good. I have a great speech here that my staff wrote, and then it'll be a wonderful op-ed someday. And then I've got a few remarks that I wanted to make. You know, first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for assembling. And I want to echo a couple of points that Maya made. First, about the presidential campaign. It was the most issueless campaign of my lifetime. I mean, and I've seen a lot of campaigns, but it was a lot more about insults than it was about issues. And that's something that, unfortunately, we missed a tremendous opportunity at the presidential level to educate the American public. You guys did a great job, by the way. I certainly noticed the ads that you ran, and I want to commend AARP for running ads, at least demanding that people actually address this stuff. But in the end of the day, campaigns are campaigns. Math is math. And, you know, the math here is pretty daunting. We face a lot of deficits going forward, fiscal challenges. And there's a variety of ways to deal with them. And Congress has actually done some work in dealing with the deficit. You have to remember, in 2010, it was $1.4 trillion. So it's come down fairly dramatically. We've done that mostly through the Budget Control Act, mostly by squeezing the discretionary part of the budget. You know, we're spending less in the discretionary areas, defense and the appropriated agencies, than we were when George Bush was president. So that's like real progress. And cumulatively, it's saved like something like $1 trillion in the amount of time since the Budget Control Act happened. We've done something in the tax area. People forget this, but we have raised taxes. That's what fiscal cliff is all about, and that was about $700 billion worth of new revenue over a decade. And despite all the reports you read, we've actually done some things in terms of efficiency. I'm sure most of you saw the quote covered up report in the Department of Defense about $125 billion worth of savings that could be had. If you actually look at the NDAA bill we have, you'll find actually some of those things dealt with. Senator McCain, Congressman Thornberry, and frankly their respective Democratic counterparts are really focused on that, and I think will continue to focus on it. But at the end of the day, you can do all those things, and you're still never going to balance the budget. You cannot just do spending cuts. You cannot just do tax increases. You cannot just do efficiencies. At the end of the day, if you don't do entitlement reform, you're not doing anything at all. And I actually think this is more, again, as Maya said, I'm more interested in the process than I am in the various proposals. There's a lot of different ways, particularly with Social Security, to get there. It's a pretty easy problem to solve because it's basically a math problem. We know how many people turn 65. We know about what their life expectancy is. We know about what they've paid in. We can predict the revenue flow here pretty easily. So as long as you're not trying to make a huge philosophical point, I want private accounts or I want to end this. If you just want to fix the system, it's a pretty easy way to get there. And the Greenspan Commission of 35 years ago is the perfect model. Because and frankly, it has all the right lessons. And when John and I began talking about this problem across the aisle, that was the place we went back and looked. And we came up with what I think is a pretty simple, basic proposal. 13-member commission, 7 and 6 in favor of whoever happens to have the presidency. The 2 minority leaders in this case would each get 3 appointments. Senate minority leader, House minority leader. Same thing for the speaker. Same thing for the majority leader. The president would pick a tiebreaker. You would have to have 9 votes to report anything out. So anything would have to be bipartisan by necessity. In Congress, you'd have a year. And frankly, it shouldn't take you a year. We have enough proposals that you could really look at it, bargain it out. It should take a long weekend, to tell you the truth. And then in 60 days, come to Congress, 60 days of straight up or down vote. Now, what are the real requirements? I mean, the process, I think, is pretty easy. Well, first, you need to get at some point presidential or at least legislative leadership interested in doing something about this. I mean, everybody talks a good game right here. As a guy that's on the budget committee, I always complain, and I'm an appropriator. To us, the budget really matters. There's a line in there called 302A, which sets the total discretionary spending of the United States government. We actually live within that line. It has real force. On the other hand, everything else in the budget, Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, I'll get on my appropriators high horse here. They never, it's irrelevant to them. We'll write the budget stuff out. We'll propose, you can be for or against the Ryan Premium Support Plan or what have you, but they never even pick it up and turn it into real legislation and vote on it. And it's always, well, we can't get that through the Senate. Well, so believe me, we pass lots of stuff through the House and we can't get through the Senate. Just actually write the legislation and move it. But, we need that, and frankly, we need presidential leadership. And again, I can fault both candidates in the last campaign for failing to provide any. And both of them were smart enough to know this problem's going to get here. And frankly, both of them were smart enough to know they were going to be running for re-election with a rising deficit if they don't do something on entitlement reform in the immediate future. The last point I want to make is people act like this is the third rail of politics. Now, I want to offer something counterintuitive. I think it's precisely the opposite. This is an easy win for whoever will seize it. I would sort of like to be the president, if I were the president, that saves Social Security. It's the most popular program in the country. And arguably, in many ways, the most effective. If you want to look at it as an anecdote for senior poverty, the part of the population, the lowest percent living in poverty is people over 65. And 1 out of every 10, roughly, live in poverty. Kids under 18, about 1 out of every 4 grow up in poverty. So this is a popular program. People know it. And I can go to any town hall, any place in America, certainly any place in my district, and say, I've got to compromise on save Social Security. Now, we're going to have to do a couple things we don't like to do. We may have to raise the cap and tax more raises. We may have to adjust the rate a little bit. We may have to have progressive indexation. We may even have to have means testing. But at the end of the day, as long as those people in that audience know they're going to get a Social Security check, which about half of them believe they won't, then I promise you, I'll win the political debate. So I think this is something that's easy. I think it could be very bipartisan. Unfortunately, we haven't had a president since George Bush that wanted to talk about Social Security, and he sort of had an agenda, he had a plan. I would actually argue, stop advancing the plan, advance the process instead. And we haven't had a minority, either ours when we were in the minority, or the Democrats when they were in the minority, that's really wanted to pick this up because they've seen it more as a political weapon to be used, force the other side to deal with it and beat them up for what they do. I would actually say embrace it, and you could be really popular. I mean, this would be counterintuitive, to a lot of people, but I promise you, there's not a lot of political risk. Last point I want to make before I turn it over to John. And John, you've got just a terrific guy to work with on the other side of the aisle. He's a guy that's thoughtful. He's actually generated bipartisan proposals. I think it sounds like I'm laying out his race for governor in a couple of years in Maryland. I'm not. I actually want to keep him in Congress where he'll be protected but in the minority. He's just a great guy, and a guy that actually sees problems and wants to solve the problem as opposed to score political points about the problem. So, number one, again, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for what you're doing. And help us push this through, because at some point, believe me, the next president of the United States is going to have to deal with this. The deficit is going to go up every year. We are going to have to look at Medicare and Medicaid as well, and all these entitlement programs that collectively are almost 70% of the entire federal budget. This is the easy one, and I think I'd start with the easy one first. It's popular, it's mathematical, and we can all do it and then go home and sell it pretty easily, as long as somebody in a leadership position will just start beating the drum for it. Thank you very much. Good to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
Morning, everyone. So I want to start by saying how much I appreciate working with Tom Cole on this and several other matters. As someone who's relatively new to Congress, who has tried to work on some bipartisan things like Tom has talked about, it's been a real blessing for me to work with such an experienced, thoughtful, and generous man as Tom Cole. So it's you can tell by his comments that he thinks about the world in a very clear, kind of linear, compassionate way. And so it's really great to work with you, Tom. Maya, thank you for organizing this. Your work, you've been a tireless champion of this and so many other issues. And I want to thank everyone for being here. So something's happening in the world right now that I think is ultimately very positive, and I'm not referring to Mr. Trump's election, by the way, but it's rising interest rates. And most people think that's somewhat of a counterintuitive point, but I've thought for a long period of time that interest rates at this kind of artificially low level have really distorted behavior in many ways, and have given the American people and American business a sense that things are still not normal, right after the financial crisis, which is now been close to 10 years. We've still been living in this period of time where interest rates were a bit of an anomaly in terms of how low they've stayed for how long. And I think it's created the perception that the economy is still not, has strong footings yet, et cetera. And I think rates going up will ultimately be positive for consumer behavior and business behavior. But I think it'll also be positive for behavior of the government, because rates being low, like they have been for so long, has allowed us not to confront some of the important issues that we need to confront. And reforming and strengthening Social Security is one of them, because if you go back to the 90s, an era where people thought economic growth was generally pretty good, people have a generally pretty fond memory of the economy of the 90s, productivity was growing, et cetera. If you were to take a look at the average interest rates across the 90s and extrapolate them to today, then the interest on the debt would be 3 times what it is today. And that obviously puts a lot of pressure on the federal budget. Now again, I think there's a compensating benefit, which is rates being a little higher, I think will ultimately be good for the economy. But I think it'll finally be the forcing function that we need on this issue and several others. And we all know Social Security is an enormously successful and important program. If you think about the conditions of the world for our seniors when Social Security was put in place, right, which was kind of the tragic stories of how bad it was for seniors in America before Social Security was put in place. And you fast forward to where we are today and what's happened to the standard of living of American seniors, this has been one of the most successful programs ever launched by the federal government, to my mind at least. And it's gone through periods of time where it's been strong and it's been under pressure. I mean, cumulatively, Social Security is still a net positive program, which I always bristle when people say that Social Security is bankrupt and broke, et cetera, because it is not. It is absolutely not. Across its history, more money has been paid in than has been paid out, right? So it is a solvent program. The problem is right now we're paying out more than we collect. And if that continues, as you all know, for another 15 years, then the cumulative positive will become a cumulative negative, and that's when Social Security technically becomes insolvent. But that term doesn't really mean anything because it's not like an enterprise that can go bankrupt, right? It's just math and how it relates to the federal government's overall budget. And we've had this situation before where we've confronted the exact same set of facts, where it was cumulatively positive, but it started to go negative, and people projected that those deficits would continue, and then one day it would go insolvent. And that is the situation that the people around in the late 70s, early 80s were confronted with when President Reagan and Tip O'Neill put together the commission, the Greenspan Commission, which has been so successful. And those individuals were given a mission, and their mission was very clear: extend the solvency for Social Security for 50 years. And also make sure you don't do anything to hurt this incredibly important program. And by the way, try to strengthen it. Try to make sure it continues its mission. And that's what they did. And if you look at kind of the report card, they extended it almost for precisely 50 years. So their actuarial assumptions were very good, their math was good, they actually got the numbers right. And the poverty rate among seniors has been cut in half. It's been cut in half since they made those changes. So to me, it's hard to say that those individuals were anything other than heroes. They were given a job, a very important job for American seniors, a very important job for the fiscal health of the country, and they went and they did it, and they hit their goals. And so Tom and I are really just trying to reproduce that same outcome. The commission we've designed is substantially similar to the way the commission was designed in the early 80s. Tom had a really good idea to make sure it's a supermajority of the commission. There's 13 commissioners, and I think 9 need to approve a plan before it comes back to Congress. That was Tom's idea, and it was a good one. His view was we want to make sure this is more than just token bipartisan. We want to make sure there's a couple of members of each side supporting the proposal. And we've decided that we think this commission should think about 75 years of solvency versus 50, and we've given them the same direction, which is to not hurt the program. And I'm incredibly confident, as Tom said, if this process is put in place, that well-intentioned people who understand the program and are armed with the actuarial data that they need can put forth a proposal that actually strengthens the program and extends its life. And no matter how you approach this program, I mean, I've put out my specific proposal as to what I would do if I were fixing Social Security by myself. I'm sure Tom has done the same. I don't think Tom and I have even ever compared what our solutions would be. And the reason for that is we're really focused, as he said, on the process. Getting this process right is so important because we will get to the right answer as a country if we pursue the right process. So we're hopeful, I'm hopeful that this proposal that we put forth can be acted upon. I've talked about maybe starting to pair it with a debt ceiling discussion because there's some symmetry to that, right? There's a lot of pressure, particularly on Tom's side of the aisle, not to raise the debt ceiling without doing something. It seems to me pairing a debt ceiling increase with something like this, which is a very constructive step towards our long-term financial trajectory, makes a lot of sense to me, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. I also agree with Tom that this, if we actually confront this for what it is, and we address this in terms of stewardship, as opposed to pure partisan politics, there's a very good political opportunity for people. I talked about this a lot in my recent re-election. I represent a district that's competitive, right? In presidential years, a few more Democrats than Republicans vote. In non-presidential year, a few more Republicans than Democrats vote. So it's a very competitive district. I represent suburban Washington, where there are a lot of liberals, and Western Maryland, which is a very conservative place. So I like to say it's a moderate district, but it doesn't have a single moderate in it other than me. And in both of those kind of constituencies, I talk about this issue. And I talk about its importance. I talk about why the program's been so successful. I talk about the challenges. I try to explain it, you know, because people come to this debate with so much misinformation. The money's been stolen, there's been some trust fund, it's broke, it's gonna run out of money, all these kind of, you know, false data around this program. And I point out to people that I'm part of the only bipartisan bill in the House around Social Security reform, which I think our bill actually is the only bipartisan one. And you see the heads nod, right? Because no matter what we hear in the media, I think fundamentally most Americans want us to work in a bipartisan basis once the elections are over. They want us to come together, work together with the other side on the important issues that affect a broad number of Americans. And there's very few issues that affect a broad number of Americans more than Social Security. There's very few issues that most Americans view as important as Social Security. And the fact that this can be done on a bipartisan basis around this process and allow us to push politics aside for a minute and just set up a process, I think most Americans view as the right answer if you actually have the opportunity to explain it to them. So I agree with Tom. I think we should be embracing this politically. Clearly, as a matter of policy and substance, it's the right answer. But I think there's a lot of political upside, particularly for the new administration. I mean, one constituency that the new administration, they might not care about this, but one area where they actually need to get some traction is among kind of the leading policy thinkers across the country, call them the, for lack of a better term, the editorial board elite. This is an area that group is focusing on, and I think if the new administration were to take a positive step along the lines that we're talking about, I think it'd be a great opportunity for them to get credibility with that segment of the public. So again, I want to thank Maya, I want to thank Tom, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Third Way and everyone else who contributes so valuably to this effort, and look forward to more discussions. Thank you.
Thank you both, Congressmen. Before we bring up our panel, I'm just going to have a couple of questions for the lawmakers here. In terms of the path forward for the bill, who is going to be your cheering section beyond just the editorial board elites, do you think? I mean, is it AARP? Who's the constituency who you need to kind of help push this through?
Well, we're counting on starting with you guys, actually, so. But yeah, we do need somebody to pick it up, like AARP, that has a considerable amount of muscle behind them. And, you know, hopefully we'll look at this as something that the kinds of reforms that come out of here are going to be, they're not going to be anything that shakes up or changes the fundamental nature of the system. That's just not likely to be produced by a bipartisan commission that has to achieve a supermajority. It's going to be the kinds of reforms around the edges that are incremental and cumulative over time, and that make a big difference, and again, actually preserve the program, and create an opportunity for bipartisanship. Now, if you want to like get rid of Social Security, or you want to go to individual accounts or something like that, this probably isn't the vehicle you're going to use. You're going to have to try and ram it through. But if you actually want to achieve a bipartisan consensus and frankly really help the federal budget in the long term, this is the single largest program that we have already. It's only going to grow. Then this is, I think, the way to go. And so we're hopeful with the new administration that they'll see this, because again, this president, President Trump, assuming he runs for re-election, will be running for re-election with a rising deficit. There is no other way to do this other than do something, frankly, he said he wouldn't do in his campaign, which is deal with entitlement reform. You got to get there. And this, to me, is the easiest single vehicle. And by the way, if you're going to get rid of Obamacare, you're going to have to touch Medicare and Medicaid some way, because you know, both of those programs are integral parts of Obamacare, both in terms of money transfers from Medicare and raising the eligibility rates essentially for Medicaid. I mean, those two things are absolutely fundamental to the program. So you're going to have to do some of this stuff anyway. This at least will be popular and could be bipartisan.
Yeah, and I think no matter what your perspective on Social Security, other than, as Tom said, unless you want to completely restructure the nature of the benefit, right? I mean, if you're talking about guaranteed basic income and you want to get rid of all entitlement programs, et cetera, this is not the right forum for that. But even if you want to expand Social Security, for example, right, this is a forum where you can actually make that pitch, theoretically. You know, again, Tom and I have been spending time trying to sync up our own views as to what to do with Social Security because we don't view it as relevant to the process. But I think there should, for example, be a supplemental benefit put in for people in their later years because there's a lot of data, particularly among women, because how much longer women are living today, that they're running out of money, that retirement projections are all changed, obviously. And I could see this commission is a good way of making a case for that as part of larger reform, for example. So I think that one of the problems with Social Security is right now there is no safe place to actually talk about what we should do with the program, right? Because the minute you say anything about it, you're potentially subject to a political attack. I think a commission like this, which would obviously have a process where they could get input and have testimony and have people put forth proposals, I think should be something that people who care about this program or care about specific changes to this program should embrace because they should view it as a place where they can actually make their case. So I think everyone should really become a supporter of this, almost no matter what your perspective is, unless you come to the table, as Tom said, with a completely different view about how these type of benefits, and by the way, that's a decent intellectual argument on its own, based on what's happening in the world of technology and disruption, et cetera, but that's another discussion.
You mentioned maybe pairing this with some discussion of raising the debt ceiling. I can hear the vendors saying, well, Social Security is not the driver of the deficit, so a little bit. But is that, Congressman Cole, you think, a politically good opportunity to push this?
Yeah, I do, because I think, I was talking, I'll leave the senator unnamed to protect him, but I was visiting with Senator of the other party, and we both had a common objective in which we failed, which was to try and force an omnibus as opposed to a CR. You know, we'll get you into all the details of budgeting, but this was a really bad idea that we're about to do. But it'll be worse because you know, we would have a sort of guarantee through September 30th of funding. Now it's just through the end of April. And that will roughly coincide, it'll be a month after, but we'll have a debt ceiling coming up in March. And, you know, I would hope that my good friends on the other side of the aisle are responsible and bipartisan. But if I were in their shoes, I think I'd say, you guys run this thing, so you probably need to raise the debt ceiling mostly on your own. That's going to be a shockwave to the Freedom Caucus and a number of other people when a Republican president comes in and says, you can't shut down the government on me. You got to do something. And we may get in a situation where we require Democratic votes to do that. This would be an appropriate price to extract, I would argue, is let's do something. And I've voted to increase the debt ceiling on many occasions. I've voted on other occasions not to, and I've voted both ways under both presidents, but I've always argued, just give me something in here that will deal with the debt to some degree. Now, you're quite right. Again, this is, as John pointed out, a program that is not in crisis and that is got a substantial surplus, et cetera, et cetera. But I guarantee you your constituents don't believe that. This is an opportunity to fix it. So to me, I wouldn't consider that blackmail. If I were on my side of the aisle, I would consider that an opportunity and frankly a fair request. And we ought to be pushing it on our side because again, there are members like me that I will vote for something to raise the debt ceiling. I know you got to buy the time, as long as we're doing something about the long-term deficit. If we're not doing anything, it's just like raising your credit card rate without changing any of your spending habits. I mean, you got to do some, or limit. You got to do something that suggests down the road you can change the arc of this.
Yeah, and I mean, look at the debt ceiling. I don't think the debt ceiling is really that relevant because what matters is the debt as a percentage of the economy, not the absolute level of debt, which I think most people have a similar view. But Social Security could one day affect the debt, obviously, right? If we go to the period, the date when it becomes kind of, it inverts and it goes from being on a cumulative basis positive to a cumulative negative, then one or two things happen. Either you cut benefits by 25% as the projection, which will never happen. It would be immoral to do that, in my opinion. to suddenly call up all the beneficiaries and say, today, right now, immediately, your benefits are cut by 25%. I mean, think about how the sky was falling around the sequester. Could you imagine what the political pushback on that would be? Or you put the debts on the balance sheet of the government of the United States, which will balloon our debt as a percentage of the economy. So this is a real debt issue. It's just not in the 10-year window yet.
Well, thank you both very much. We're going to bring up our panel now, and I think you all have index cards. If you have questions, feel free to put your questions on them and then pass them to the right, and we'll take those. I'll just give a quick introduction, and then they're going to make some opening remarks to kind of set the table for this conversation. Maya, who of course is our host here for the committee responsible for the budget, and a veteran of economic, tax, budget policy debates, and she helps make sense of those for lay people on National Public Radio and lots of other journalistic outlets. Ed Berkowitz is a historian, author of 11 books, including Mr. Social Security, and he's going to sort of walk us through some of those lessons of the Greenspan Commission. Sal Schieber is a former director of research at Watson Wyatt and was a member of the Social Security Advisory Panel that worked from 1994 to 96, and you're going to help us understand some of the lessons of what didn't work in that process, I guess. And then Jim Kessler is from Third Way, Vice President for Policy there, an organization dedicated to what he calls the Vital and Daring Center, where new ideas grow and orthodoxies wither. So why don't we start with Maya and just to kind of give us the big picture?
Okay, I'm going to be brief because you already heard from me, and I'm more interested in the discussion with a really good group of panelists. I think one of the issues that we have is that the numbers and the political narrative around Social Security just don't line up at all. And so the first thing that I always would recommend to anybody is to look at the Social Security Trustees report or the report from the Congressional Budget Office that lay out the situation that Social Security faces. And one can either look at the program in isolation as a program where we have built up surpluses. Those surpluses are now being drawn down. They will run out in the early in the early 2030s. Or one can look at it as how it is affected and affects and is affected by the federal budget. Either way, I believe you come to the conclusion that part of budgeting and part of these important programs is looking at our national priorities, figuring out what's important, and figuring out how we're going to finance them. One of the things that I think is completely clear about Social Security is that it continues to be a major national priority. A lot of times when it's politicized, there's kind of discussions about people wanting to end the program or not supporting it. I just don't see the evidence of that. I see an ability to concern people about the future of it and make people worried about where it's headed, and so it's used as a political bomb to be tossed between the different parties. Sometimes I feel like they're fighting over who wants to promise to protect it more, and that the story really needs to expand to show that putting the finances in place so that the promises that we've made, we have a plan for how to pay for them, is part of protecting the program. The final thing I'll say is that all budgeting is about trade-offs, and we need to look at, again, both the program and how we're going to meet the needs of the program, which are both about retirement security, auxiliary benefits, and the insurance about outliving your savings or other unexpected events, and also the trade-offs that there are in the overall budget. We have many, many unmet needs in this country, and just take the fact that we have growing deficits, near record levels of debt, which are going to be growing faster than the economy, and growing deficits. Take that aside, we have unmet needs in terms of infrastructure, something we've heard a whole lot about, education, worker training, basic research, security, poverty, a whole long list of things. And I think it's really important that we look at how to strengthen Social Security and also how that fits into our overall national priorities. And so one of the biggest concerns I have is that in our discussion about federal budgeting regularly, we don't look at these trade-offs and we don't look at the ways to add stability into the priorities that we do put in place. So I guess my hope for a commission, and I really do support the work of Congressman Delaney and Congressman Cole, is that, again, like they said, focusing on the process of putting in place a plan that would have more permanence and more stability than what we currently have, which is just knowing we don't know where the program is headed, would meet a lot of the major needs of both budgeting and Social Security. Thanks.
Ed, it's been 35 years. What did the Greenspan Commission get so right, and what lessons can we draw?
Well, thank you. Nice to be here today. I want to make just a couple of historical points about this Greenspan Commission, which has been said is 35 years old, and I suspect beyond the memory of most of you, not all of you. There are probably some people in the room that went to the meetings or played a part in it, but most of you probably didn't. So I want to say something about the general context of the Greenspan Commission. You all know that Alan Greenspan was an economist and was the head of the Federal Reserve Board for a time. And I want to make three other sort of historical points about it. In terms of the general context, it's important to remember that there were definite political issues and liabilities involved in the forming of the Greenspan Commission. Its original impetus came from the president, Reagan at the time, who had proposed a Social Security bill that really went nowhere and was voted 96-0 or something in a Senate resolution to be a bad thing. They realized they had to somehow get through the next period of time, which was, in that time, was the 1982 congressional election. So that was the point of the whole exercise. And it's also important to remember that the Ways and Means Committee in the House had, they were fairly active on this issue at the time. There was this guy named Congressman Jake Pickle, who some of you may remember was from Austin, Texas, in the same district where Lyndon Johnson lived. But he was on a Social Security subcommittee, and I think he would have liked to have taken this issue a little further. And when it came time to make the Greenspan Commission, he was asked, do you want to be a member of this commission? And he said, no, I'd like to keep the ball in my court. And that was the same also with Congressman Rostenkowski, who was the head of the Ways and Means Committee. He said, no, we want to keep that. I think very much in keeping, by the way, with Rostenkowski's personality, not one to cede things to others. So that was the general context. Let me make just three historical points about the Greenspan Commission, if I might. First point, the Greenspan Commission had very high-profile political members, which made it unique at the time among commissions. People like Senator Dole, who would eventually run for president and was the majority leader. People like Senator Moynihan, who was a big leader in those days of liberals. It included high-profile business and labor interests. And I kind of wonder if such a group could be assembled today. There's not so many analogs. I think about, for example, Silicon Valley employers. Where do they fit in this advisory council setting? Or another one that was on the commission was Congressman Claude Pepper, whom some of you may remember. He was always called Senator Pepper because he had once been a senator from Florida, but he was kind of played the role as the spokesman of the elderly. That was kind of considered, even though he was in a district in Florida, the elderly were his national constituency. It's not clear that we could replicate that. And then, of course, the even bigger problem is that the leader among the Democrats in the Greenspan Commission was Tip O'Neill, who has been mentioned, who was congressman from Massachusetts, what was John F. Kennedy's old district. And he was a majority leader, so he had a position of some authority. He was the leading Democrat. And needless to say, we really don't have that now. The bill that was proposed would have, like the minority, like Nancy Pelosi might be the person who would name the Democratic members, but it's not clear that would have the same clout. But Tip O'Neill turned out to be very important in the Greenspan Commission. He was kind of the one with whom the White House dealt. And I wonder, would somebody like President Obama be brought forward, or Secretary Clinton or something, to kind of give a high status Democrat? I don't know. And also, with regard to membership, the question is, who could play the role that Robert Ball and Robert Myers played? These are other old names that you hear about in Social Security, who I suspect names that are fading among the present generation. But these were two people that were absolutely dedicated to Social Security. And on the Greenspan Commission, Robert Ball was named as a member by Tip O'Neill. He had been in previous days the Commissioner of Social Security, and at the time was kind of a freestyle consultant with an office near Capitol Hill. But he also played the very important role of being the staff leader of the Liberal coalition. He just took that upon himself. And he had had a lot of experience with advisory panels. And as those of you who may remember him, he was very sharp and very tactical. It's not clear you could replicate that. The second point, at the time of the Greenspan Commission, there really was an action-forcing event. There was a possibility that, say, by July of 1983, remember they're talking about right before the 1982 election, so by July of 1983, not very distant, the Social Security might run into a problem and not be able to send out checks or full checks or whatever. Everybody was aware of that. That was generally agreed, and that put a focus on things. To say that the program might go into deficit, in the 2030s, lacks some of the same sting. I think that you could say, well, I can have my breakfast and go on. There wasn't that feeling with the Greenspan Commission, and of course it also meant that people tended to accept the program as it was, which is to say a defined benefit program with inflation protection, with family and survivors and disability benefits. And in fact, at one point in the meetings, this one congressman from somewhere, conservative guy, Mr. Wagner from Louisiana, he started talking. He says, I realize now that we're just not going to do that. We're not going to have a fundamental conservative shift in this program to something. And the conservative models were not as well developed then. And after that, it just really became a mathematical game, as people have been talking about today, trying to find so the numbers would balance, including that, as Mr. Schieber can tell you, lots of gimmicks, like taking account of uncashed checks and adding that to the wealth of the fund. They did things like that. But even then, there was a lot of standing around until the 1982 election. And it was only after the 1982 election that anything happened, and it really wasn't the commission that did the work. It was a group of people within the commission, including Robert Ball and including White House staffers that really did the final work. My final point, if I might, what does President Trump have to do with it? And that really is a question on the table in general. Ronald Reagan, who really was an ideologue and really wanted to change Social Security and had talked about it throughout his career, but when it came time to sign the 1983 amendments, he signed it, he invited everybody to come, he was very proud, he kind of took great pride in that. It's not clear whether how President Trump feels about that. Would he be willing to cede leadership of this issue to Congress, or would he prefer to try his own hand at fixing the problem, maybe working with congressional leadership? I mean, at the present time, the workings of the Trump White House kind of are opaque. So, each of these things raises some doubt in my mind over whether now is the time for another Greenspan Commission. Perhaps we might see what our new government, who are coming in a few weeks, is able to do, and if that new government reaches a stumbling block, then turn to a Greenspan Commission. Thanks.
Scott Schieber.
Thank you. I'm probably one of the few people in the room that went to every one of the public sessions of the Greenspan Commission. It was a long, drawn-out process, often fairly dry, a lot of technical detail. In the final analysis, the Greenspan Commission itself did not come to an agreement that solved the problems that they set out to address. After they pretty much had shut down their deliberations and there was a sentiment that they had failed in fulfilling their charter, Senator Bob Dole wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times saying that the program was too important not to come back and try and figure out how to truly embrace these issues and address them in a meaningful way that would make the program sustainable. Senator Moynihan embraced the thoughts in Senator Dole's op-ed piece, and they began to work together, engaging Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, and put together a very small, intimate working group. It included Bob Ball, and they negotiated basically an agreement to move forward on legislation. Jake Pickle, actually, I think in many regards, had a longer-term commitment to making the system sustainable than maybe any of the other participants in the discussion when it finally got to the point of developing legislation. And he was the person who was adamant that the retirement age issue had to be addressed in order to get the financing on the back end of the program to make it sustainable, actually more than 50 years at the time they concluded their discussions and the legislation was signed. At that juncture, it was projected to be sustainable for the next 75 years. 75 years at that juncture was quite meaningful because the last member of the baby boom would turn 99 years of age in that 75th year, which meant that they had pretty much resolved the financing issue for the duration of the baby boom generation's lives, both their working careers and their retirement. Now, to put that in the context of the current discussion of what the issues are today, for the last 15 years, there's not been a serious bipartisan discussion about Social Security. The Republicans stumbled into the issue of individual accounts in a very clumsy way. They thought that somehow there was a free ride here, at least in many of the early proposals. The Democrats called them out on the proposals and were able to classify what was being proposed as some kind of a raid on the trust funds, and use that as a club to show that the other party was trying to ruin the program, the traditional program. There have been other countries around the world who have introduced individual account elements to their program. Sweden is a shining example. They have not somehow become an extremely conservative country because they've done it. Their program has not fallen apart because they've done it. They did it as part of a solution to make their system financially viable over the long term. I actually participated in two of George Bush's council presentations around the country in 2005, and at the end of the second one, as people were going around and he was shaking their hands, the people that had participated in the session, he engaged me briefly. I'd written extensively on the issue at the time, and he said, you know, I think the problem in the discussion right now is these individual accounts. He said, we're missing the more important point about what we need to do to address the really serious financing issue that we have here. So we ought to take that completely off the table. I agree with it. I've written subsequently about that. I was one of the early advocates of a Swedish type adjustment. But that's not going to work because it stops the dialogue, and there has to be a dialogue. And somehow we need to restart the dialogue, and there is the potential, I believe, that a commission could do that. The second important thing is it could start a public education process. The system is underfinanced. There is no zero-sum solution. We're going to somehow gore somebody's ox. And so we need to figure out how we're going to choose whose ox we gore. Now, when we look at the population, the recipients, and the people who are actually contributing, because they've got money in the game as well, a lot of it, there are some particularly vulnerable people. And I think we need to be very sensitive to those. And it seems to me we could start an education process that would demonstrate to the American public that there are certain people we need to be very careful about, but there are other people in this society who are actually currently beneficiaries, who are doing extremely well, who might also be part of the solution. And it seems to me if we could start a public discourse and a public education process, that possibly the public would embrace things in a way that our politicians could come together and actually form some proposals that would have the potential to carry the day. But if the policy discourse on one side is going to continue to be whack-a-mole, and the discourse on the other side is to ignore the reality of arithmetic, as Representative Cole talked about today, then we're not going to get anywhere, and a commission will just be an additional waste of time. At some juncture, we need to quit wasting time. Every day that we put this off, we're passing the full load on to future generations, and it gets higher and higher for those future generations. And I'm old enough now that I not only have children, I have grandchildren, and the idea of passing all of my bills on down to them, when I would be perfectly capable of helping pay some of the bills myself, just seems to me to be untoward on the part of what we're all about here.
Thank you. There we go. And thank you, Maya, for hosting this in CRFD, one of my all-time favorite groups. So no one's dream is to wake up in the morning and say, we're going to dream up a commission. You know, it's not the most exciting word in the English vocabulary, but Third Way, my organization, we've been in favor of a Social Security Commission for a long time, not because it's the most exciting thing, but we feel it is the most realistic, practical way to modernize Social Security, keep it solvent. And you know, I've been in politics and been in this town for 30 years. I know the types of legislation that Democrats like to do. I know the type of legislation that Republicans like to do. And fixing Social Security has things that both parties really don't like to do. There's, as you just pointed out, like somebody's ox is going to be gored, and there's a reward, as Tom Cole and John Delaney said, but there's also a price. And neither party wants to pay that price. Neither party wants to do it on their own. And in the absence of the type of bipartisanship that would put a bill together and move it forward, there needs to be a proxy, and that proxy would be a commission. Point number 2. Other than the Greenspan Commission, we've seen an experiment about a commission on Social Security very recently, and we should feel very good and very heartened about it. And I don't know if there's anybody here from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Is there anybody here? There we are, back there.
I was on that commission.
And I didn't realize you were on that commission. I was not, so I'm a completely objective observer, and I recommend that if you're ever on a long flight and you need to kill a few hours, you should read the report that they just came out, their commission report on Social Security and retirement. I'll be honest with you, you might doze off every once in a while, but this report shows that you can make Social Security solvent, you can increase benefits for the most vulnerable populations, you can do things for the most elderly, taxes are going to go up, but not in an onerous way, and you can do all sorts of things to encourage private retirement savings, and you can make the lives of future senior citizens much better. So we have a dry run there. My third and final point is this. I'd like to encourage the organizations that lobby on Social Security to come on board for this or something like this. I feel some of the groups have been very, very responsible, but also I feel that many of the groups, they just shout down any sort of idea, and they're stopping people from moving forward on this issue. And they're hoping, well, if we have a complete Democratic majority, we can do this, that, and that. Well, we did have a complete Democratic majority, and they didn't want to touch it. And if in the future we have a complete Democratic majority, and that future is a long way away, speaking as a Democrat, the solutions that people are talking about, they're not going to want to touch that either, because there's a lot of oxes that get bored there. And the alternative on the right-wing side is, if Republicans control everything, the solution they might choose, which they did in the past, that ended conversation, that doesn't work either. So the groups that have essentially been saying to folks, don't do anything, or do this one thing, my feeling, it's time for those groups to get on board on a commission. Thank you.
Again, if you've got questions, you want to put them on your index card, just pass them to the right. My question I had when I was first told about this meeting today is, Donald Trump campaigned saying we don't need to raise taxes, we don't need to touch benefits, we're going to grow our way out of this problem. How unrealistic is that? And does if the guy in the Oval Office says that, is that a dead end for this process?
We cannot grow our way out of Social Security financing issue. It's a demographic issue. When we've got economic growth in the economy, we've got wage growth. When we've got wage growth in the economy, we have Social Security benefit growth. It is not a sufficient solution. It is a myth that is thrown around very frequently by both parties during political campaigns that that's all we need to do to solve the problem.
If the president, though, is taking that position, is there sufficient leverage in Congress to just avoid that roadblock?
Well, let me answer that actually in 140 characters or less. Everything Trump does is an opening negotiation. That's it.
And it seems to me the potential for education here might actually play some role in changing that opinion, which maybe is an important opinion right now. I served on this commission at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And it is interesting when you're working toward a goal and you know you have to get there. There were 19 of us, ultimately 18 of us signed on to the package. One of the issues that came up at one juncture was raising the retirement age, and there's a lot of opposition to raising the retirement age because the lowest income people have the shortest life expectancies. And when you raise the retirement age, it affects them on the benefit side more dramatically than anyone else. It reduces their lifetime benefits. And it seems to be a pretty nasty way to solve Social Security financing by putting it on the back of the people that have had the most miserable lives to begin with. And actually, Alan Ruther and I, Alan was General Policy Director, I guess, for the AFL-CIO for years. Ruther's a famous name in that union, if you don't know. He and I worked together on a solution, and we're kind of odd bedfellows. And we ultimately crafted a solution whereby the people with the lowest lifetime average incomes would be exempted from this increase. And now, we couldn't sell it to the whole commission, but in this setting, we both saw that if this was an important way to address the financing issue, the long-term viability issue. And we worked together, and it seems to be in the commission environment, if people really do want to get to the end goal, you can see those kinds of coalitions build, and people work together in a way they don't seem to in the congressional setting that we have today.
I guess I would say it's a good question because I think that the presidential debates and discussions were really an unfortunate starting point for the discussion on Social Security, but not one that can't be turned around. I think sort of the idea is that you should either not touch the program because you can grow your way out of problems, or you can fix it with getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, which was kind of one of those myths I thought we had put aside decades ago, and it's reemerged. And let me be clear, if you were to get rid of all the waste, fraud, and abuse in Social Security, you would extend the life of the trust funds for a couple months at the most. This is not a fix. And as Syl said, you can't grow your way out of it. And discussion about expanding the program, I think, has its place as part of an overall solvency package. As Congressman Delaney said, people over 85, there's much higher rates of poverty. Talking about guaranteed minimum benefits, those are the kinds of things that I think have a lot of support and should be part of an overall solvency plan. But I do think for any efforts to be successful, there are a couple things that have to happen. But the very first one is that people have to agree that there's a problem. And some of our speakers kind of alluded to this. If there continues to be the misinformation that there is no problem or we can wait, it's very hard to take the further steps of having the real discussions about the trade-offs and the necessary choices. So I do think leadership, either presidential leadership or congressional leadership, or an action-forcing moment, as you discussed, have to be there to help push this along.
basically one piece of misinformation is the scope of the problem, and the congressman hinted at this. When you talk to a lot of younger people, they're just resigned. They think there's going to be no Social Security that comes their turn. Not that they're facing a 25% haircut, but they think it's going to be totally gone. And I think that the fixes would have to be really draconian, when really it seems to me these fixes are really kind of at the margins. Tweak the knobs a little bit here and there.
For this generation of people, like the interns that are working on Capitol Hill, it's true that they don't know as much about the program as they should. And so we said the worst case scenario here is that there is a deficit or whatever, and benefits could be 75% of what were promised to be at the time, which is actually more than they are today. That's important to realize. And I think also that the mechanics of the system are not terribly well understood. I think, and that might come from the fact that this idea of a defined benefit program, which is one of the really distinguishing features of the Social Security program, that might be alien to a lot of folks now. They're not used to having any kind of retirement scheme with a defined benefit, and so they're not aware of it. And of course, as the advocates would always tell you, they also are unaware of the fact that they themselves could either die or become disabled, and that connection is often lost as well. So this public education mission, it needs to go on, and maybe has lagged a bit lately.
I think back to something that President Obama said during the 2008 campaign when John McCain proposed a commission in a different context. And he said, a commission is Washington speak for "we'll get back to you." It's a way for policymakers to punt. And you talked about providing political cover. Those sound like sort of cop-outs for lawmakers, but is there value in political cover and punting and "we'll get back to you"?
Yeah, I don't think that I'm saying anything that people aren't aware of when I say that politicians need political cover and need to punt because they're no longer doing their job. It is really an unfortunate place that where we are right now is that so much of what we need to do is figure out how to help members of Congress and the president make decisions and then protect them from it, or give them a way that they don't have to own their decisions. And I think the sequester is one of the best examples of an attempt to do that kind of went awry. We continue to think of ways to force members or encourage members to make choices that they should be making on their own and not have to take responsibility for it. Is that ideal? Of course it's not. This is a terrible time politically in terms of being able to work on longer term issues and take ownership of hard choices and work in bipartisan ways. But I think if one is resigned to it, and you have to be looking at all the evidence of the kinds of things that aren't happening, a commission is a very useful way to lend the political cover that many members of Congress we talk to will say, we know that we need that. And I also think a very excellent point was made before that both parties tell themselves these are changes they want to make on their own terms. Oh, and only if we have the majority, or if only we have the majority and the White House. So one party now has the majority and the White House. And it seems pretty clear so far that they are not about to attempt to make changes to Social Security and fix this program on the terms they might tell themselves they would want. And I think the same thing is true on the other side, because neither party wants to have to own things that are hard choices. So allowing somebody to say, I know we have to address this. I don't really think this is the perfect solution, but it's good enough, and I'm going to go ahead and hold my nose and vote for it. Seems like a more likely model for change than waiting for politicians to take the initiative right now at a time when that doesn't happen much at all.
You ask if commissions work in general, they don't. I was on the staff of a presidential commission when President Carter was in office, and it was agreed on all sides that this was supposed to have an agenda for the 80s was the name of the commission. That's an example of something that is not likely to work, too vague. And when that commission, when we finished our work, Ronald Reagan had been elected, which is the kind of thing that can happen. But I think for some things that the commissions do work. I was thinking about closing military bases, a decision that nobody wants to make. Setting Medicare rates, a technical decision that is hard to make. Those sorts of things can be made by commissions. What the commission does less well is in solving grand philosophical problems.
Well, it does seem like, this is a problem that one could approach from sort of a technocratic basis. That's why it's always struck me as the easier problem than, say, Medicare. You don't have death panels to worry about. You're not dealing with a huge medical infrastructure. It's just just as has been said, math and checks or now electronic transfers.
And if we make those changes now, in the next couple of years, we still have kind of that very end of the window to do it in a way that anybody who depends on the program truly is protected from them. Though I would caution that if we wait much longer, that window's starting to close, and then it creeps into that you're gonna have the middle class pay a much broader, bear a much broader piece of the burden if
Well,
we wait any longer.
this gets to one of the audience questions, and you talked about whether there is the urgency here, and maybe y'all can kind of bridge that divide. Question, if Social Security has enough money to pay full benefit through 2034, why deal with it now?
Well, that's what Harry Reid said, said that a few years ago. It's like, wake me when it's 2033. So.
But obviously you'd be staring at a much different set of options in not
You would.
2033, but in 2025.
Right, I mean, look, one of the differences between now and the Greenspan Commission was the demography was working to our advantage, in the 70s and 80s when they were making those decisions. The demography doesn't work to your advantage now. And it increasingly doesn't work to your advantage. So that's why it makes sense to do it. And the point that several panelists made earlier was how much of this burden of fixing this are you going to keep on to a younger generation that, by the way, has had kind of flat wages for the last 15, 20 years. Like, how much more burden do you really want to put on that group of people?
Now, if you, let's do it in very simple arithmetic terms. If we wait till 2034, 2033, the preferred Reed solution we'll call it. The payroll tax, we would, one of them, I think Representative Cole this morning said, we can't possibly cut benefits then. It would be immoral. Okay, so we can't cut benefits. We've got to raise taxes, payroll tax. 5% on average, because that's what our deficit is. At least that's what it's projected to be. It'll be higher than that when we get there, I can assure you. I've watched these numbers for a long time. Think about paying an additional 5% tax over a 40-year career. That's a cumulative 2 years of pay that we would be expecting, that I would be expecting my grandchildren to pay over their working career. 2 additional years of their pay relative to what I paid. Not 2 years total, 2 years additional to protect my benefits today.
In contrast, what would the rate be now if you did it next year?
Well, if you did it next year, it would be a couple percent, 2.5%. It'd be half that. But it would be spreading it out across a much broader set of people. Because we would have people who are working the next 30 years, or 15 years, who would be paying taxes that they won't be paying if we put it off for 30 years, or 15 years. So it's an intergenerational issue.
So we have a challenge here, which is the politics are wait till the crisis hits, and the economics are act as quickly as possible. And those are at odds.
Yeah, and you still would prefer it if your politicians would occasionally go with the numbers and the policies over the politics. I mean, there's so many reasons why you need to make the changes right away or as quickly as possible. First, these are kinds of changes that must be made gradually. You can't announce that the retirement age is going up next year. You need to put it in place. You need to give people plenty of warning, and then you need to do it gradually, a couple months at a time, which is how we've done it before and how the various commissions have recommended it.
To go back with a little bit of history, the reason that Ronald Reagan got his proposal cut off about knee level, they were facing this financing shortfall in 1983, and so they needed to come up with a proposal. They came up with this very austere proposal that within the next year or so, people who were retiring on disability benefits would have a very substantial reduction, and people retiring at age 62, instead of getting 80% of the full lifetime benefit of the normal retirement age benefit, would only get 50%. The senator that introduced the resolution in the Senate that passed 96-0 or 98-0 was Senator Bob Dole, Ronald Reagan's own lead senator in the Senate, introduced the legislation. So we're not going to cut those benefits in the austere way that we're talking about.
We have just time for, I think, one more quick question. Sure.
Final point about that, because there's two other things.
You're banking.
So it should be gradual, but the second point is that if it's not spread out, the costs of it grow dramatically. And so if you just look at the cost of not having done this over the past 8 years, when President Obama was in office, that has increased by 25 to 35%, waiting that. If we wait another 10 years, the cost will increase by 50%. And finally, this is a program about planning. The whole reason to have Social Security is to help people plan and have insurance, and to have a government that says, changes are coming, but we're not going to tell you what they are, is completely at odds with that. And I would just posit that the only reasons to wait are two. One, you don't want to own this. You don't want to own a tough decision, and that's not a good enough reason to be a leader. Or two, you believe that you would do it better on your own terms. And I would say that both parties have had the chance to do it that way and have shown they don't really actually want to own it and do it on their own terms.
This is one of those hold hands and jump together.
Yes, yeah.
Very quickly, question, just about out of time. I guess I'll give this to you, Jim. Do you think any Democratic members of a commission would support changes, and I guess that means reductions in benefits?
Yes. I think they'd be reluctant to do so. I think there's a lot of pressure not to do so. I think, look, one of the problems that's going on here is in the last 6 elections we've had, 5 of them, at least in one house or in the White House, the party has changed. So both parties see a huge political advantage in exploiting whatever the other party is going to do. But I think that if you're going to get together a commission, and let's say they do the exact same thing that what the Bipartisan Policy Commission just put out with its plan, I think a lot of Democrats would support that. I don't think they realize the panoply of options that are available to make people's lives better. Frankly, I wasn't aware of it, and I look at this pretty closely.
Again, a lot of them not pain-free, but not exactly
Not
terribly
awful.
painful.
Yep.
You know, in 1983, they did raise the retirement age. There wasn't an idea from the Greenspan Commission. Turns out that was Jake Bickle's idea. That was Congress's idea. But they voted for that, and that's one that you would say that it's just a non-starter for a Democrat. So it can happen, and maybe in the case of 1983 legislation, to give some points to this commission idea, it's because it was bundled with other stuff. Since it was on this must legislation to save Social Security.
And we've just elected a 70-year-old president, and Joe Biden's not ruling out a run before he goes.
If you look at the Bipartisan Policy Center pact, we did propose to raise the retirement age modestly, very modestly. But we also raised benefits for people in the bottom third of the distribution very substantially. I think we reduced the poverty rate in 2050 by about 30% among the elderly, according to Urban Institute projections. We raised the benefit very substantially, so people who still retire at age 62, even with the higher retirement age, would be better off than they are under current law. If you only look at one facet of that proposal and say, I don't want anybody to raise the retirement age because poor people die sooner than old people, you're missing the very important substance of what's in that package.
Well, I'm going to have a flight home for Christmas. I'm going to have some reading here. Thank you all very much.